the walls of San Quentin State Prison have witnessed everything: fear, madness, and the final heartbeat of America's most notorious killers. Inside California's death row, over 600 men wait in silence, each with a story darker than the last. Tonight, we step inside that world, where justice, guilt, and survival blur together behind steel doors. If you believe every story of crime deserves to be told, truthfully, fearlessly, and without filter, subscribe now and join us on this journey into the mind of the condemned. Movie camera inside San Quentin Death Row. 10 Most Dangerous Inmates. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. The gates of death row. At the edge of San Francisco Bay, where fog rolls over cold gray waters and gulls circle the sky, stands one of the most infamous prisons in America, San Quentin State Prison. Its massive limestone walls rise from the shoreline like the walls of a medieval fortress. For more than 170 years, it has been California's final stop for the condemned, home to death row, the most secure and psychologically intense unit in the state's correctional system. Founded in 1852, San Quentin has witnessed every era of American justice, from hangings in the yard to lethal injections behind glass. Over the decades, the prison has held thousands of men sentenced to die for the state's most brutal crimes. But inside those steel doors, beyond the echoing tiers of the East Block, are a handful of inmates whose cases changed the way the world saw punishment itself. Each man's story is different, but all share one thread: violence so shocking that the state decided they should never walk free again. This chapter begins where those stories converge, behind the bars of California's death row, where time stops, fear thickens the air, and even the guards know every shift could be their last. The architecture of death. San Quentin's death row occupies a world of its own. The East Block, an aging structure of concrete, rust, and shadows, holds over 600 condemned inmates, the largest death row population in the United States. Each man lives alone in a 5 by 10-foot cell with a steel sink, a bed, and a small barred window facing the bay. When the tide is low, the stench of salt and decay seeps through the ventilation grates. According to correctional officers interviewed by the Los Angeles Times, noise never stops. Radios blare from one cell, screams echo from another, and somewhere, a man laughs at nothing. Guards call it the soundtrack of the forgotten. Every day follows ritual precision. Breakfast at dawn. Count at 7. Recreation in the small, fenced yard pens, 1 inmate per cage. Showers are monitored by armed officers posted on upper catwalk. The structure of control is total: one mistake, one misread signal, and chaos can erupt in seconds. Death row has survived riots, hostage crises, and suicide waves. Each time, the same question returns: how do you contain men with nothing left to lose? A legacy written in fear. San Quentin's history is soaked in violence. From the 1960s to the early 2000s, it housed some of California's most feared criminals, including serial killers, gang leaders, and murderers whose names filled headlines. But among hundreds, 10 stood apart for their notoriety and impact. Before we reach their stories, it's important to understand the psychology of where they lived. According to the Marshall Project and state forensic reports, nearly 70% of San Quentin's condemned population has documented mental illness. Many entered death row already traumatized, others broke under its relentless isolation. The result is a fragile world where every noise, every glance, carries the potential for violence. Veteran officers describe the experience as walking a line between vigilance and fear. "You can't let your guard down for a second," said one retired sergeant in an ABC News interview. "You're standing in a cage with killers who know they'll never get out." That kind of hopelessness, it's dangerous. Inmate 1, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Few names strike more terror in California's memory than Richard Ramirez, the so-called Night Stalker. His reign of terror between 1984 and 1985 left 14 confirmed victims and countless others scarred. His crimes, a blend of burglary, sexual assault, and murder, terrorized Los Angeles and the Bay Area. According to court filings and Los Angeles County Superior Court transcripts, Ramirez targeted homes at random, often entering through unlocked windows and attacking while families slept. His victims ranged from young children to the elderly. He left behind satanic symbols, brutal injuries, and a city gripped by fear. When he arrived at San Quentin in 1989, after his death sentence, Ramirez became an icon of evil within the walls. Guards described him as eerily calm, polite one moment, predatory the next. He spent more than 2 decades on death row, living in near isolation. According to prison records and the Los Angeles Times, Ramirez showed little remorse, often taunting the press with cryptic statements like, "You don't understand me, no one ever did." He died of cancer in 2013 before his execution date arrived. But his presence haunted death row long after, proof that even in a place built for killers, one man's reputation could dominate the air. Inmate 2, Charles Ng, the butcher of Calaveras County. In 1999, another notorious figure joined the ranks of San Quentin's condemned. Charles Ng, one half of the killing duo responsible for one of California's most horrifying serial murder cases. Alongside accomplice Leonard Lake, Ng participated in a series of kidnappings and murders during the mid-1980s that claimed at least 11 confirmed victims, though investigators suspect many more. Court documents and FBI investigative reports describe a remote cabin in Wilseyville, California, where Lake and Ng built hidden torture chambers. Victims were lured, restrained, and filmed before their death. When police raided the property, they discovered buried remains, videotapes, and journals documenting the crimes. Ng's trial became one of the longest and most expensive in California history, costing over $20 million. He was sentenced to death in 1999 and placed in East Block. Officers recall him as manipulative and intelligent, spending hours writing legal motions to delay his case. As of 2025, he remains on death row, appealing his conviction. According to the Sacramento Bee, his cell contains stacks of legal documents and hand-drawn schematics. One guard said, "He's building a world in his head, one where he's the victim." Inmate 3, Randy Kraft, the Scorecard Killer. Known to investigators as the Scorecard Killer, Randy Kraft was convicted of murdering 16 young men across California, though law enforcement agencies believe the real number could exceed 60. His nickname came from a cryptic coded list found in his car, a scorecard believed to reference victims. According to Orange County Superior Court records, Kraft was arrested in 1983 when police stopped his car and found a dead man in the passenger seat. Inside the vehicle, investigators also discovered rope, alcohol, and a coded notebook listing dates and nicknames. After years of forensic work, prosecutors linked Kraft to bodies dumped along highways across multiple states. Kraft's demeanor on death row, described in interviews by former prison psychologist Dr. John Mendoza, was coldly analytical. He spent his time reading legal journals and writing essays proclaiming innocence. He saw himself as smarter than the system, Mendoza said. That arrogance never left him. As of this recording, Kraft remains on death row, one of the longest-serving condemned prisoners in California's history. He has outlived governors, wardens, and nearly every other inmate who entered with him. Inmate 4, Scott Peterson, the case that divided America. In 2004, another name joined the roster, one that brought television cameras swarming to the gates of San Quentin, Scott Peterson. His conviction for the 2002 murder of his pregnant wife, Lacey Peterson, and their unborn son, dominated global headlines. Court filings and California Supreme Court records show Peterson's trial was one of the most publicized in modern history. The prosecution argued that he staged a fishing trip in San Francisco Bay to cover the murder. Defense attorneys insisted the case was built on circumstantial evidence and media bias. In 2005, Peterson was sentenced to death and transferred to San Quentin. Unlike the serial killers around him, Peterson's case became a cultural battleground. He maintained his innocence in media interviews, and supporters launched online campaigns claiming he was wrongfully convicted. In 2020, California's Supreme Court overturned his death sentence due to procedural errors, though his conviction remained intact. As of 2025, Peterson's sentence is life without parole. Even after leaving death row, his case remains a reminder that San Quentin's most dangerous inmates aren't always defined by body count, but by the weight of national obsession. The system within the system. Life on death row runs by its own laws. Inside San Quentin, officers distinguish between condemned, segregated, and general population inmates. Death row prisoners cannot have contact visits, hold jobs, or move freely. Their world shrinks to a few square feet and a handful of faces glimpsed through steel mesh. According to California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR data, more than 80% of San Quentin's condemned population has been on death row for over a decade. The average wait between sentencing and execution in California exceeds 25 years, though the state has not executed anyone since 2006 due to ongoing legal challenges. In practice, most condemned prisoners die of natural causes, not the death chamber. Former Warden Gene Woodford once called death row a warehouse for human despair. Guards echo that sentiment. "It's a ghost town full of breathing men," said one officer in a 2021 interview with The Guardian. "They talk about death every day until it doesn't mean anything." An uneasy calm. For new arrivals, the first nights on death row are often the hardest. The sound of the electronic gate slamming shut, the clank of shackles, the sudden silence afterward, it's a ritual of psychological domination. Inmates call it the introduction. According to letters published by Prison Legal News, the first thing a man hears in East Block isn't a greeting but a warning shouted from another cell. "Welcome to the row, where time stands still." Those who survive the first months adapt in strange ways. Some find religion, others art. A few study law and file endless motions. But beneath every routine lies the same truth: no one leaves this place alive unless the courts say otherwise. For decades, executions at San Quentin were carried out in the death chamber, a small green-tiled room once equipped with a gas chamber, later replaced by a gurney for lethal injection. After the 2006 moratorium, the chamber was sealed, its equipment removed. It now stands empty, lit only by a single fluorescent bulb. Guards refer to it as the museum. The weight of memory. Every cell in East Block carries ghosts. Some inmates leave behind drawings, letters, or etchings carved into concrete. Others leave silence. Officers say that walking the tier feels like walking through history, the echoes of 100 trials, verdicts, and last words. In 2016, California voters narrowly upheld the death penalty, ensuring San Quentin's death row would remain operational even as national debate raged over its morality. Critics from the ACLU, Human Rights Watch, and the Death Penalty Information Center argue that the system is broken beyond repair, citing racial bias, wrongful convictions, and inhumane conditions. Supporters counter that it provides justice for victims. Yet inside those walls, justice feels abstract. What remains is survival, for inmates and officers alike. As one longtime guard told the San Francisco Chronicle, "This place isn't about justice anymore. It's about endurance. For them and for us. A world frozen in time." As night falls over the bay, the lights of San Quentin glimmer faintly through the fog. From across the water, commuters driving home can see the silhouette, a reminder of a justice system still wrestling with its own conscience. Inside, men lie awake counting years instead of days. Each cell holds a story. Each story reveals another face of America's most complex punishment. And in the next chapter, we'll step closer into the minds of the condemned themselves, the 10 men whose names define San Quentin's death row. The 10 faces of death, inside San Quentin's most feared inmate. In the heart of California's most infamous fortress, where the walls seem to hum with decades of tension, 10 cells stand out, not because of size or privilege, but because of the stories inside them. Each one holds a man whose name once dominated headlines, courtrooms, and nightmares. Together, they form the living archive of San Quentin's death row, a gallery of fear, regret, and, in some cases, calculation colder than steel. 1. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Even on death row, Richard Ramirez was treated as a ghost story. Guards who worked the tier in the late 1990s still recall the sound of his voice, calm, deliberate, unsettling. He would stand at the bars, eyes half-shadowed, quoting scripture or whispering, "Hail, Satan." According to Los Angeles County Court transcripts, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries, a spree that turned California's nights into terror. After his arrival in 1989, Ramirez spent more than 2 decades confined to a single cell, reading books on black magic and true crime. He was allowed no contact with other inmates. San Quentin logs show that staff avoided unnecessary interaction. His mere presence rattled the new recruit. A 2013 prison medical report later revealed he was dying from complications of lymphoma. Until his last day, he refused to express remorse. As one officer later told the Los Angeles Times, he never looked afraid. Everyone else did. 2. Charles Ng, the engineer of horror. Next door to Ramirez, Charles Ng continued his endless paperwork. Stacks of legal motions surrounded his bunk like a fortress. He once said to a prison psychologist, "I'm my own best lawyer." Court filings show that his crimes with Leonard Lake involved kidnap, torture, and murder, meticulously documented in homemade videotapes discovered at their cabin in Wilseyville. According to FBI records and the Sacramento Bee's investigative timeline, Ng lured victims, mostly couples, before subjecting them to unimaginable cruelty. When brought to trial, he exploited every legal loophole possible, prolonging proceedings for years. At San Quentin, his reputation is that of a manipulator, using intellect as a weapon. Guards nickname him the Professor. He spends his days writing appeals and sketching floor plans of imaginary buildings, all under fluorescent light that never goes out. 3. Randy Kraft, the Scorecard Killer. Randy Kraft, the man behind one of California's largest serial murder cases, is described by prison staff as polite, precise, and utterly emotionless. Investigators linked him to at least 16 confirmed murders, but his own coded list, a sheet of cryptic nicknames, hinted at nearly 60. He preyed on young men, often military personnel, from Orange County to Oregon. In 1989, Orange County Superior Court sentenced him to death. At San Quentin, Kraft is known for his routine: 6 a.m. reading, 10 a.m. writing, afternoon law research. He rarely speaks, never complains, and maintains he was framed, a claim repeated in letters published by Prison Legal News. To guards, he's the embodiment of quiet menace. One officer told the San Francisco Chronicle, "You forget what he's done when he's talking. Then you remember and you feel cold." 4. Cary Stayner, the Yosemite serial killer. Not far from Kraft's cell sits Cary Stayner, a man whose story is stranger than fiction. He was the brother of Stephen Stayner, the child famously kidnapped and later rescued in the 1970s, a tragedy that inspired television movies and public sympathy. But in 1999, Cary became infamous for entirely different reasons: the brutal murders of 4 women near Yosemite National Park. According to FBI affidavits and court records from Stanislaus County, Stayner confessed in chilling detail as strangulation, decapitation, and mutilation. When interrogators asked him why, he replied, "I've wanted to kill since I was 7. At San Quentin, Stayner is reclusive, rarely speaking even to staff. He draws landscapes from memory, trees, cabins, rivers, scenes of the wilderness that once hid his crimes. The images, according to psychologists who've seen them, are eerily peaceful." 5. Douglas Clark, the Sunset Strip Slayer. Douglas Clark, one half of the Sunset Strip Killers, has been confined at San Quentin since 1983. His crimes with accomplice Carol Bundy involved the murders of at least 7 women in Los Angeles, mostly young sex workers. Court documents describe Clark as narcissistic and manipulative, obsessed with power and control. During trial, he acted as his own attorney, turning proceedings into a spectacle. At San Quentin, he continues to write letters defending his innocence. In 2020, the Los Angeles Daily News obtained a series of handwritten manifestos from Clark, where he accused prosecutors of a satanic conspiracy. Guards consider him unpredictable, charming one day, aggressive the next. As one warden put it, he never left the courtroom. He's still on stage. 6. Richard Allen Davis, the killer of Polly Klaus. The case that redefined child abduction laws in America began with Richard Allen Davis, convicted for the 1993 kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Polly Klaus. Her disappearance from her Petaluma home sparked a nationwide search and massive media coverage. Court transcripts from Sonoma County Superior Court show overwhelming evidence: fingerprints, fibers, and Davis's own confession. The outrage following Polly's murder led to California's 3 strikes law, making repeat offenders eligible for life imprisonment. On death row, Davis is viewed as one of the most despised inmates. Guards refuse to interact more than necessary. Other prisoners avoid even looking at him. In 2013, during a televised sentencing appeal, Davis smirked at Polly's family, an act that drew public fury. As of 2025, he remains confined under constant monitoring, his name forever tied to one of California's darkest crimes. 7. Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. Few inmates carried a stranger dual identity than Rodney Alcala, a serial murderer who once appeared on national television. In 1978, Alcala appeared on the dating game while secretly wanted for a string of murders. When he was finally arrested, investigators discovered hundreds of photographs of women and children in his possession. According to Los Angeles County Superior Court filings, Alcala was convicted for at least 5 murders but suspected of many more across multiple states. He represented himself in court, cross-examining witnesses, including family members of victims. His charm and arrogance made headlines. Inside San Quentin, he was known as the Talker. In 2021, Alcala died of natural causes after spending over 30 years on death row, yet his photographs continue to resurface in police databases, linking him to cold cases even after death. 8. Scott Peterson, the husband the world watched. Though his death sentence was overturned, Scott Peterson remains one of San Quentin's most recognizable former inmates. His case blurred the line between true crime and media spectacle. Convicted of murdering his pregnant wife, Lacey, in 2002, Peterson became the face of suburban betrayal. According to San Mateo County court records, Peterson maintained innocence throughout. Journalists covering his time at San Quentin noted his composed demeanor, reading, exercising, avoiding confrontation. Even among killers, he was an anomaly, educated, articulate, and calm. Guards said he spent most of his time writing letters to supporters and family. After his death sentence was vacated in 2020, Peterson was moved off death row, but his name remains etched into its legacy. 9. Lonnie Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper. Known as the Grim Sleeper, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was convicted of murdering at least 10 women in Los Angeles between 1985 and 2007. For decades, his crimes went undetected, hidden under a pattern of neglect and indifference toward victims from marginalized communities. According to Los Angeles County Superior Court files and The Guardian's 2016 coverage, DNA evidence finally connected Franklin to multiple cold cases. His nickname came from the long gap between killings, a supposed sleep that lasted 14 years. At San Quentin, Franklin kept to himself, rarely leaving his cell. Other inmates described him as quiet, almost invisible. In 2020, he was found dead in his cell, cause undetermined but suspected natural. His death ended one of the longest-running murder cases in California history, but not the questions it raised about how many victims remain unidentified. 10. Kevin Cooper, the man who claims innocence. Among the condemned, Kevin Cooper stands apart, not for brutality, but for controversy. Convicted of the 1983 Chino Hills murders, in which 4 people were slain with a hatchet and knife, Cooper has maintained his innocence for 4 decades. His case, according to the New York Times and NBC News, has become one of the most debated in modern death penalty history. Multiple judges, including from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, have questioned the handling of evidence. DNA retests ordered by Governor Gavin Newsom in 2021 are still pending. Cooper's letters from death row, published by The Guardian and the Marshall Project, describe life in isolation and the fight for exoneration. He writes about the sound of foghorns on the bay, the smell of bleach, the way light falls through bars like broken glass. For supporters, Cooper represents the flaw in a system built to kill. For critics, he remains a convicted murderer. Either way, his story ensures that San Quentin's death row remains a mirror of America's moral divide. A corridor of shadows. Walking the East Block is like walking through a living museum of crime, psychology, and history. Each cell tells a chapter of the American criminal narrative, from the satanic panic of the 1980s to the forensics revolution of the 2000s. And though executions have been halted since 2006, San Quentin's death row continues to operate, its population aging, its future uncertain. As one veteran guard said in the San Francisco Chronicle, "We're caretakers of ghosts. The world forgot them, but we still feed them breakfast." What remains constant is the paradox. These are men who took life from others, yet the state now sustains theirs indefinitely. Inside these walls, justice doesn't feel final, it feels suspended, waiting for history to decide what it truly means. Voices from the row, inside the minds and consequences of the condemned. When you stand outside San Quentin on a fog-drenched morning, the prison looks calm, even beautiful. The bay sparkles, gulls circle the towers, and for a brief second, it's hard to imagine that behind those pale walls are hundreds of men sentenced to die. But inside the East Block, where the condemned wait, the silence is heavy, a silence built from regret, denial, and the weight of justice measured in years instead of moments. This final chapter isn't about the crimes anymore. It's about what comes after, the psychological aftermath of living on death row, and what those voices tell us about the American system of punishment. The sound of time. Prison officers often say that on death row, time doesn't pass, it circles. Every day repeats with mechanical precision. The clang of cell doors, the smell of disinfectant, the rattle of food carts down the tier. For men who've spent decades here, years begin to dissolve into routine. A 2020 report by the Marshall Project described inmates who could no longer remember what year it was. One prisoner told a journalist, "I stopped counting birthdays after my 10th year here. I measure time by executions, when they used to happen." Psychologists who studied condemned inmates at San Quentin call it institutional death, a condition where the body remains alive but the mind accepts extinction. According to California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR data, more than 60% of death row inmates exhibit symptoms of severe depression or post-traumatic stress. Dozens have died by suicide or medical neglect since the state halted executions in 2006. The artists and the agonized. Over the years, death row has produced unexpected artists, writers, and thinkers, men who found ways to create in confinement. Some paint portraits of the outside world, others write essays for newspapers under pen names. One such voice was William A. Noguera, who transformed from gang member to painter and author while awaiting execution. His essays in The Atlantic and The Guardian describe what he called the paradox of death row, a place that kills both body and mind, yet occasionally sparks self-awareness. "You learn what you are when there's nothing left to lose," he wrote. Another inmate, whose letters were published by the San Francisco Chronicle in 2018, spent 25 years drawing images of birds he could only hear through the window. He said it helped him remember freedom by sound. His drawings now hang in a small prison art exhibit curated by volunteers from the Prison Arts Project. Even within those small acts, there's an undercurrent of sorrow. Every brushstroke and word is an argument against disappearance, a plea not to be erased. Confronting guilt and denial. Inmates respond to guilt in very different ways. Some deny responsibility until their final breath. Others, facing age or illness, begin to confess. In 2019, a man convicted of double homicide in Los Angeles wrote a letter to the victim's family. "I can't undo what I did, but I can stop pretending I didn't." The family never replied, but the letter was published by the Los Angeles Times, sparking national discussion about remorse on death row. Yet, for every confession, there are denials that never fade. Kevin Cooper, whose case remains under review, continues to claim innocence, writing essays that argue systemic bias and evidence tampering. Civil rights groups like the ACLU and Innocence Project cite his case as proof that the system is fallible, that even one wrongful conviction makes the entire process morally unsustainable. For others like Charles Ng or Randy Kraft, guilt is irrelevant. They see themselves not as killers but as survivors of a flawed system. Psychologists describe such inmates as egocentric nihilists, men who rationalize everything, even horror, to preserve a sense of control. The guards who never forget. Death row changes not just the condemned but also those who watch over them. Many correctional officers suffer from nightmares, anxiety, and burnout. A 2017 CDCR internal wellness survey found that more than 40% of San Quentin staff reported symptoms of trauma related to prolonged exposure to extreme confinement environment. One retired officer, speaking to ABC News in 2022, said, "I came here believing in justice. I left wondering if justice meant watching people die slowly." Another officer described moments of reluctant empathy. "Some of these guys thank you for breakfast. Then you remember what they did, and it doesn't make sense anymore." The emotional toll is cyclical. Guards witness human collapse daily but are expected to stay detached. Over time, detachment becomes defense, and the line between duty and despair begins to blur. A system in suspension. California's death penalty has been in legal limbo for nearly 2 decades. The last execution took place in 2006. Since then, litigation, moral debate, and political hesitation have left San Quentin's condemned population aging inside cells built for finality but not for eternity. In 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom announced a moratorium on executions and ordered the dismantling of the lethal injection chamber. The gurney was removed, the room sealed. Yet, none of the inmates were resentenced. They remain on death row, waiting for a punishment the state no longer carries out. Human rights advocates call this the living death penalty. One former prosecutor told the Washington Post, "It's punishment without closure, for victims, for families, for everyone involved." Today, some of these men have been waiting longer than their victims lived. Others entered the row in their 20s and now approach old age, their crimes receding into history while their sentences remain frozen in time. The moral divide. San Quentin is not just a prison, it's a question. Every debate about capital punishment eventually leads back here. Supporters argue it's a necessary deterrent for society's worst crimes. Opponents counter that it's a moral contradiction, a system that kills to prove killing is wrong. In 2021, the Death Penalty Information Center released data showing that 60% of Americans support life without parole over execution. Yet 27 states still maintain active death penalty statute. California, despite its moratorium, continues to house over 600 condemned inmates, a paradox that defines modern American justice. Philosopher Brian Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, once said, "The death penalty is not about whether people deserve to die for their crimes. The real question is whether we deserve to kill." That question echoes through every corridor of San Quentin. Echoes of the past. When the prison was first built in the 1850s, executions were public. Crowds gathered on hillsides to watch hangings. By the 20th century, they moved behind closed doors, gas chambers, then lethal injections. Each method claimed to be more humane, yet each left the same moral residue. The old gas chamber still stands, its steel doors sealed, the seats rusting. Tour guides call it a historical artifact. For many, it's a reminder that society's need for vengeance often disguises itself as justice. San Quentin's transformation from gallows to gurney to moratorium mirrors the evolution of America's conscience. But the question remains unanswered: if the system no longer kills, why does death row still exist? Whispers of redemption. Not every story ends in darkness. Some inmates, against all odds, find purpose, mentoring younger prisoners, writing anti-violence essays, or joining restorative justice programs. Chaplains and volunteers report that some condemned men express genuine remorse and spend years writing to victims' families, seeking forgiveness they may never receive. One Catholic chaplain described a condemned inmate who crafted rosaries out of soap and string for volunteers to distribute in the community. "He'll never leave this place," she said, "but somehow he still found a way to give something back." Moments like that don't erase crimes, they expose something deeper, that even in places built for punishment, humanity sometimes survives. The unseen victims. Behind every story on death row are families. Victims' families who relive the trauma each time a case resurfaces, and inmates' families who live with public shame. Court records often omit their pain, but advocates like Mothers Against Murder document it. The constant appeals, the reminders, the years of uncertainty. A mother who lost her daughter to one of San Quentin's inmates said in a 2023 PBS interview, "We wanted justice, not a lifetime of headlines. They said death would bring closure, but there's no such thing." Her words echo the truth, that the death penalty, in practice, rarely heals anyone. It only extends the suffering across generations. The future of death row. As of 2025, California plans to phase out San Quentin's traditional death row entirely, transferring inmates to high-security prisons under a reform and rehabilitation model. The proposal, announced by Governor Newsom, reimagines the prison as a center for transformation, focusing on education, mental health, and reentry training. Critics call it symbolic, supporters call it historic. Either way, it marks the end of an era. When those cells finally empty, they'll leave behind not redemption, but record, a record of what happens when a society tries to balance justice and mercy on the same blade. As the fog thickens over the bay and the prison lights flicker on, San Quentin remains, scarred, silent, and eternal. The men inside may fade, but the questions they raise will never die. Disclaimer: this story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Sources: California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, Death Row Reports, 2018 to 2025, The Los Angeles Times, Inside Death Row, The Washington Post, California's Moratorium on Execution, The Marshall Project, Psychology of Isolation, The Guardian, Kevin Cooper Case Review, ABC News, The Death Penalty Information Center, The San Francisco Chronicle, PBS Interviews.